My name is James Whitfield. I spent 22 years in the Coldstream Guards. I have stood in freezing rain outside Buckingham Palace without moving a single muscle for 4 hours straight. I have marched in full ceremonial uniform through the streets of London while tourists screamed in my ear and shoved cameras 3 inches from my face. I have watched young soldiers do things in the name of duty that most people would not believe possible. But the story I am about to tell you is not about any of that. This story is about one night, one guard, one figure standing in the dark that should not have been there. And what happened when a trained, disciplined, decorated soldier of the British Crown walked toward it alone in the fog at 3 o'clock in the morning because his duty demanded that he did. The date was December the 9th, 2003. Windsor Castle in December is not the Windsor Castle tourists see in the summer. The flowers are gone. The golden light is gone. The cheerful crowds with their cameras and their children and their little flags all gone. What is left in December is stone. Ancient, cold, unapologetic stone. Walls that have been standing since the 11th century. Towers that have watched empires rise and collapse. And fog. In December, the fog comes in off the Thames like it owns the place. And some nights it gets so thick that you can lose a building in it, let alone a man. On the night of December the 9th, 2003, the fog was the worst I had seen in 6 years of Windsor posting. I remember standing at the duty officer's window at approximately 2:30 in the morning, looking out at the North Terrace and seeing absolutely nothing. Not darkness, fog is not darkness. Fog is worse than darkness. Darkness is honest. Darkness tells you it is hiding things. Fog pretends to show you something while hiding everything. You look into it and your brain starts filling in the gaps. Shapes appear that are not there. Distances collapse. A wall 20 feet away looks like a doorway 2 feet away. A post lantern looks like a candle floating in midair. That is the environment in which Thomas Reeve walked out for his solo perimeter patrol at 2:47 in the morning. That is the environment in which Thomas Reeve saw the figure. And that is where this story truly begins. Before I tell you what Thomas saw, you need to understand what it means to be a Coldstream Guard on nighttime patrol at Windsor Castle. Because if you do not understand that, you will not understand why what he did next was one of the most remarkable things I have witnessed in over 2 decades of service. The Coldstream Guards are the oldest regiment in the British Army in continuous active service. They were formed in 1650. That is not a typo. 1650. They have been on active duty without interruption for over 370 years. They served at the Battle of Waterloo. They served in the Crimean War. They served in both world wars. They have stood guard outside royal residences through plagues, through riots, through bombings, through everything this island has thrown at them, and they have not once abandoned their post. When you put on that uniform, you are not just wearing wool and brass buttons. You are wearing every man who wore it before you. You are wearing Waterloo. You are wearing the Blitz. You are wearing 370 years of unbroken duty, and the weight of that is not metaphorical. You feel it. Every single day you feel it. Nighttime patrol at Windsor is a different discipline from the ceremonial duties most people associate with the Guards. There are no cameras at 3 in the morning. There are no tourists. There is no crowd to perform composure for. At 3 in the morning, it is just you, the castle, the dark, and the rules. And the rules do not change because no one is watching. That is precisely the point. The rules are not for the audience. The rules are for the castle. The rules are for the crown. The rules are for the 370 years of men who held this line before you and will hold it after you are gone. Nighttime protocol at Windsor in 2003 required solo perimeter patrols of the inner ward every 45 minutes between midnight and 6 in the morning. The guard on patrol carried a radio, a torch, and a weapon. He was required to challenge any unidentified presence within the restricted zone using a verbal warning, loud, clear, and repeated 3 times if necessary. If there was no response to the verbal challenge, The guard was required to advance and investigate, while simultaneously radioing his position to the duty officer. Simple enough on paper. Considerably less simple in thick December fog at 2:47 in the morning. Thomas Reeve was 23 years old on the night of December the 9th, 2003. He had joined the Coldstream Guards at 19, gone through training at Catterick, passed out with commendation, and been posted to Windsor in his second year of service. By the time this story takes place, he was in his third year, and in those 3 years he had built a reputation that was, in the most affectionate possible terms, entirely contradictory. On one hand, Thomas Reeve was one of the most naturally disciplined young soldiers I ever commanded. His bearing was flawless. His uniform was always immaculate. His attention to detail during inspection was the kind that made senior NCOs quietly satisfied and never admitted it. When Thomas stood at his post, he was completely, absolutely, almost unnervingly still. Other young soldiers fidgeted. Thomas did not fidget. Thomas had apparently decided at some point in his early life that movement was optional and had acted accordingly ever since. On the other hand, Thomas Reeve had what the regiment had come to refer to with great affection and only slightly disguised exasperation as the Reeve situation. The Reeve situation was this: if something unusual, inconvenient, bizarre, or frankly inexplicable was going to happen anywhere within Windsor Castle, there was a statistically improbable likelihood that Thomas Reeve would be standing in the immediate vicinity when it did. In his first year, he had been the guard on duty when a corgi, one of the late queens, which shall remain nameless for reasons of royal dignity, had escaped from the private apartments and spent 45 minutes attempting to follow Thomas on his patrol route, as though it had been specifically assigned to assist him. Thomas had completed the entire patrol with the corgi trotting 6 inches behind his left heel, filed his report without mentioning it, and only admitted the incident when the duty officer asked why there were paw prints in the incident log. In his second year, he had been the guard assigned to the East Terrace on the one afternoon in living memory when a film crew, who had been given permission to shoot in an adjacent courtyard, had accidentally directed 3 supporting actors in full Tudor costume into Thomas's restricted zone, resulting in Thomas verbally challenging a man dressed as Henry VIII who was carrying a prop turkey leg and had absolutely no idea where he was. The film crew later sent a fruit basket to the guardroom. Thomas had filed the incident report with the same expression he wore for everything, which is to say, no expression whatsoever. By December 2003, the regiment had largely accepted that Thomas Reeve existed in a slightly different relationship with probability than the rest of the human population, and that the appropriate response to this was to appreciate him, document everything carefully, and try not to put him on solo patrol in conditions of reduced visibility. On the night of December the 9th, the duty roster had been reshuffled at the last minute due to a stomach illness, moving through the barracks with extraordinary efficiency, and Thomas Reeve had ended up assigned to solo inner ward perimeter patrol for the 2:45 slot. The duty sergeant, Corporal Alan Marsh, had looked at the roster, looked at the fog outside, looked at Thomas Reeve sitting quietly in the guardroom reading a field manual, and said out loud to no one in particular, "Right, here we go then." Thomas had put down the field manual, picked up his radio and his torch, and walked out into the fog without a word. The inner ward perimeter patrol at Windsor follows a fixed route. You exit the guardroom through the north door, cross the lower ward, pass through St. George's Gate, follow the wall along the north side, cross behind the round tower, come down the east side, and return through the south passage. The whole circuit at regulation pace takes approximately 18 minutes. Thomas had been on patrol for approximately 9 minutes when he saw it. He was on the north side of the inner ward, moving east, with the wall of the upper ward rising on his left and open cobblestone courtyard on his right. The fog was heaviest here, It pooled in the lower areas of the courtyard and moved in slow, deliberate rolls that made the torchlight bounce back at you instead of cutting through. Thomas had reduced his torch to the lower angle, keeping the beam on the ground ahead of him, because shining it straight out into fog at night is approximately as useful as switching on a torch inside a cloud. He had just passed the third lamp post on the north wall. He knew it was the third because he had counted them on every patrol since his first week, a habit he had developed and never explained, when he moved the torch beam from the ground to sweep across the courtyard ahead of him. And the beam caught it. A figure standing in the courtyard, approximately 30 feet away, directly in the restricted zone, completely still. Thomas stopped walking. This is the part of the story that I want you to sit with for a moment, because I think it is easy to read these words and move past them quickly. So I am asking you not to do that. I am asking you to put yourself in the position of a 23-year-old man, standing alone in the fog at 2:56 in the morning, holding a torch whose beam has just illuminated a human-shaped silhouette standing perfectly still in a place where there should be no one. The figure was dark. It was roughly the height and build of an adult male. It was standing with its arms at its sides. It was not moving. It was not making any sound. And it was looking directly at Thomas, or at least it appeared to be looking directly at Thomas. In fog at that distance, with a torch beam at that angle, you cannot see a face. You see shape, and the shape appeared to be facing him. Thomas Reeves stood perfectly still. Then he did what his training and his duty required him to do. He raised his voice, and this I know precisely because Thomas told me every detail of this himself, afterward, sitting in the duty officer's room with a mug of tea that he did not drink, and he called out the challenge. "Halt, who goes there?" His voice went out into the fog and was absorbed by it. The fog does not echo. The fog takes sound and keeps it. There was no response from the figure. 30 feet away, completely still, not a word. Thomas waited the required 10 seconds. The rulebook in his head was running cleanly, calmly, the way it always did. Protocol was not a comfort exactly, but it was a structure, and in the absence of certainty, structure is everything. He called out again. "This is a restricted area. Identify yourself immediately." Silence. The fog moved, the shape did not. Thomas waited another 10 seconds. He could feel his heart rate. He noted it the way a pilot notes a warning light, calmly, neutrally, as information. His heart rate was elevated. He noted that. He filed it. He continued. "Third warning, as protocol required. Final warning. Identify yourself or I will advance and detain." The figure stood there, in the fog, in the dark, at 2:56 in the morning, and said absolutely nothing. Thomas reached for his radio. This was the correct action. This was exactly what the protocol required. Challenge 3 times. If no response, radio position to duty officer, then advance. Clean, simple, documented. The kind of procedure that exists precisely because the alternative, a man alone making unilateral decisions in the dark with no record and no backup, is the kind of thing that ends careers or ends worse. He keyed the radio. Static. He keyed it again. More static. The thick rolling kind that tells you the signal is not just weak, it is gone. This, I can confirm, was not unusual for that particular area of the inner ward in certain fog conditions. The stone walls, the moisture in the air, the geography of the courtyard, all of it conspired on certain nights to create dead zones for radio communication. It had been logged before. It was a known issue. There were procedures for it. Specifically, if radio contact could not be established, the guard was to maintain visual on the subject, continue advancing at a measured pace, and make contact with the duty station as soon as signal was restored. Thomas knew this. Thomas had read the procedure. Thomas had, in the way that Thomas did everything, memorized the procedure so thoroughly that it was less a set of rules he followed, and more a set of instincts he operated from. He put the radio back on his belt. He took a breath, and he started walking toward the figure. Now I want you to understand something. A great many people, when I tell this story, say at this point, well, he had a weapon, didn't he? So he wasn't really in danger. And I always stop them there, because that misunderstands the situation completely. Yes, Thomas was armed. Yes, he was trained. But a weapon is not courage. A weapon does not make the fog less thick or the figure less still or the silence less heavy. A weapon does not stop your hands from being cold or your mind from constructing every possible explanation for why a human shape is standing motionless in a restricted area at 3 in the morning and not responding to 3 verbal challenges. A weapon is a tool. What Thomas had that mattered was not the weapon. What Thomas had was the discipline to put one foot in front of the other, in correct, measured regulation pace, maintaining proper protocol, towards something that every human instinct he possessed was telling him was wrong. 25 feet. The figure did not move. 20 feet. The figure did not move. Thomas kept the torch beam on the figure's midsection. You do not shine a torch at a face, because if the subject has intentions toward you, blinding them achieves nothing good and tells them exactly where your face is. He kept his right hand free. He kept his breathing even. He counted his steps the way he counted lamp posts. Automatically, quietly, a private metronome ticking away in the back of his extraordinary, disciplined, catastrophically unlucky mind. 15 feet. The figure did not move. Thomas could see more detail now. The shape was dark, dressed in dark clothing from head to foot. The posture was upright. The arms were odd, stiff, at the sides in a way that was not quite natural. The way a person stands when they are trying very hard to stand in a particular way, or the way a person stands when they are not a person. Thomas registered this. He filed it. He kept walking. 10 feet. At 8 feet, Thomas Reeves stopped walking. He stopped because at 8 feet, with the torch beam at the right angle and the fog marginally thinner at ground level, he could see enough to understand what he was looking at. It was a mannequin. A full-length, adult-sized, dark-clothed mannequin. The kind used in theatrical costume displays. Fiberglass body, fixed posture, arms molded to hang at the sides with that slightly stiff, slightly wrong quality that Thomas's trained eye had registered from 15 feet away, but his brain had declined to fully process because the alternative explanation, that it was a person, was so much more insistent. It was standing upright because it had a flat-bottomed base, the kind of base that keeps a mannequin stable on a stage or in a display case, and that base happened to be sitting on a completely level patch of cobblestone, and the fog, and the night, and the angle had conspired to make the base invisible, and the mannequin look exactly like a standing human being who had no intention of identifying himself. Thomas stood there for a moment. He looked at the mannequin. The mannequin looked at Thomas with the empty, painted, serenely unconcerned expression that mannequins have worn since the beginning of time. Thomas's heart rate, which he had been monitoring and filing and managing for the past 4 minutes, did something that I believe he would describe, if pressed, as a significant adjustment. He exhaled. And then, because Thomas Reeve was Thomas Reeve, and the universe had not yet finished with him this evening, something moved behind him. Not the mannequin. Behind him. To his left and slightly back, the direction he had come from in the fog, a sound. A very specific sound. The sound of a boot sole scraping on wet cobblestone. The sound of a person trying very hard not to make a sound while being in the process of making one. Thomas did not spin around. Thomas did not yelp. Thomas did not do any of the things that I am quite confident I would have done in that situation, and I spent 22 years in the regiment and like to think well of myself. Thomas turned around. in a single, controlled regulation movement. Right foot stepping out to the side, body rotating, torch coming up to the correct angle, free hand moving to the appropriate position. And in the beam of his torch, standing approximately 12 feet behind him, pressed against the north wall of the inner ward with the expression of a man who has just realized that things have gone very seriously wrong, was a person. A real one this time. His name was Gerald Hoffman. He was 54 years old. He was from Columbus, Ohio. He was wearing a North Face jacket, hiking boots, and a lanyard around his neck that identified him as a guest at a hotel in Windsor Town, approximately half a mile from the castle walls. He had gray hair, a neatly trimmed beard, and at the precise moment Thomas Reeves' torch beam found him, the expression of a man whose evening had not gone in any of the directions he had anticipated. Gerald, as it would later emerge in his statement, had been on a solo evening walk. He suffered from insomnia and had a habit of walking to manage it, a detail that his wife had apparently mentioned to him on numerous occasions was going to get him into trouble one day, and to which he had apparently responded with the cheerful confidence of a man who had not yet been illuminated by a British military torch at 3 in the morning. He had followed the river path from town, found a section of the outer wall that he had, in his words, assumed was a public footpath entrance because the gate looked old and the latch was loose, and had followed what he believed was a walking trail into what was, in fact, the restricted perimeter of Windsor Castle's inner ward. He had been trying to find his way back out for approximately 25 minutes. He had, during those 25 minutes, encountered the mannequin. He had, in his own words, nearly left his body upon encountering the mannequin, and had spent several minutes standing completely still at a distance of approximately 40 feet from it, trying to determine whether it was a person or not. He had then noticed a torch beam approaching the mannequin from the opposite direction, had pressed himself against the wall with the intention of remaining quiet until he could understand what was happening, and had then been betrayed by his left boot on the wet cobblestone at the precise moment Thomas turned away from the mannequin. All of this would come out later. In the moment, Thomas Reeves' torch beam was on Gerald Hoffman, and Gerald Hoffman had approximately 2 seconds to process the fact that a British Royal Guard in full nighttime patrol kit, uniform, weapon, torch, the absolute bearing of a man who does not find intruders amusing, was standing 12 feet away from him in the fog, looking directly at him. Gerald Hoffman fainted. Not dramatically, not with a cry or a stagger. He simply went, in the way that people go when the body decides it has processed quite enough information for one night, straight down. His knees buckled, his eyes rolled, and he sat down on the cobblestones in a way that was less falling and more simply ceasing to stand. Thomas Reeve crossed the 12 feet between them in 4 steps and caught him before his head hit the ground. This was, I should note, not in the official protocol. The protocol covers challenging, advancing, detaining, and radioing. It does not specifically cover catching a fainting retired accountant from Columbus, Ohio before his head makes contact with 11th century cobblestones. Thomas did it anyway. He lowered Gerald to the ground with both hands, checked his breathing present and rather loud. It turned out, because Gerald was also a snorer, confirmed he was not injured, removed his jacket and placed it under Gerald's head, stood back up to his full height, keyed his radio, which had, with the timing that only the universe can arrange, chosen this precise moment to restore signal, and said, in a voice of complete and perfect calm, "Duty officer, Reeve, inner ward north side. Radio was down. I have a civilian casualty, non-injured, conscious recovery, appears to be fainting. I also have an unidentified prop item in the restricted zone requiring removal, requesting medical check and duty sergeant to my position." There was a pause on the other end of the radio. Corporal Alan Marsh's voice came back. "Say again, Reeve." "Civilian casualty, North Courtyard, non-injured and a mannequin." Another pause. A mannequin. Yes, Corporal. A longer pause. Right, said Corporal Alan Marsh, in the tone of a man who had known this posting was going to go sideways the moment he saw the roster. On my way. Gerald Hoffman came round approximately 90 seconds later to find himself lying on the cobblestones of Windsor Castle's inner ward, covered with a British Army jacket, looking up at a young soldier standing over him with a torch, a weapon, and the expression of a man who is performing his duty, and does not require the situation to make sense in order to do so. Gerald, to his very considerable credit, said, "I am so terribly sorry." Thomas said, "Can you tell me your name, sir?" Gerald told him. "Are you in pain, Mr. Hoffman?" Gerald said he was not. "Can you stand?" Gerald said he thought so. Thomas helped him up. He collected his jacket. He confirmed that Gerald had no injuries beyond wounded dignity, which Thomas did not say out loud because Thomas was on duty and did not editorialize. He kept Gerald calm and stationary until Corporal Marsh arrived with the duty medic and 2 additional guards, at which point Thomas stepped back, stood at his correct position, and let the duty sergeant take command of the situation. Corporal Marsh arrived, assessed the scene, looked at Thomas, looked at the mannequin, looked at Gerald Hoffman, who was now sitting on a low wall drinking tea from the medic's flask and appearing to recover both his color and his composure with admirable speed, and said very quietly to no one in particular, "Obviously." The incident report filed by Thomas Reeve on the morning of December the 10th, 2003, ran to 4 pages. 4 pages is, for context, approximately 3.5 pages longer than the average Windsor Patrol incident report. The standard form has space for 6 lines of description and a checkbox for matter resolved. Thomas had attached supplementary sheets. He had included a hand-drawn map of the courtyard showing the position of the mannequin relative to his patrol route, the point at which radio contact was lost, and the position of Mr. Hoffman against the north wall. He had noted the exact timestamps of each verbal challenge. He had noted the weather conditions, the fog density by his estimation, the lamp post number at which he had first sighted the figure, the 3rd, naturally, and the precise protocol reference number for each action he had taken. It was, in the words of the duty officer who received it, the most thorough and completely unnecessary document in the recent history of this regiment. It was also entirely, scrupulously correct. The mannequin, it transpired, belonged to a theatrical costuming company that had been contracted to provide period display pieces for a royal event being prepared in one of the state apartments. A delivery of 12 mannequins in dark Tudor-era costume had arrived the previous afternoon. 11 had been placed correctly in the designated storage area. One specifically, the one in the darkest costume with the most upright posture on the most stable base, had been left in the north courtyard by a contractor who had lost count, assumed he was done, and gone home. The regiment, with the appreciation for dark humor that characterizes long-serving military units, gave the mannequin a name before it was collected. They called it Gerald. This was considered enormously funny by everyone except the actual Gerald, who did not learn of it until later, and who, upon learning of it, wrote in his letter of apology from Columbus, Ohio, a letter which arrived at Windsor Castle approximately 3 weeks after the incident, addressed with great formality to the commanding officer, Coldstream Guards, Windsor Castle, England, that he was not sure whether to be mortified or honored, and had decided after some reflection to be honored, and that he hoped the mannequin was being treated well. He also apologized, specifically and at some length, to Thomas Reeve by name. He said he had been told by the duty sergeant, in the very straightforward manner of British military personnel explaining things to American civilians, that the soldier who had found him had followed every regulation to the letter while being, and he was quoting Corporal Marsh directly here, in a situation that had no business being a situation. He said he had looked up the Coldstream Guards when he got home and had spent an afternoon reading about them. He said he thought they were remarkable. He was not wrong. Thomas Reeve remained at Windsor for another 2 years before being posted elsewhere. During those 2 years, the Reeve situation did not diminish. He was on duty the afternoon a television crew's drone malfunctioned and landed in the middle of his patrol route. He was the guard nearest the gate when a French school trips coach driver made a wrong turn and put the front end of a 47-seat bus through the visitor entrance barrier. He was, on one deeply memorable occasion, the guard who discovered that a family of foxes had established a den in a disused storage room off the South Passage, and had to file the incident report that resulted in the foxes being humanely relocated by a wildlife officer who arrived in a van that, and I can confirm this because I saw the paperwork, was marked Royal Household Fox Management. Every incident report was correct. Every form was complete. Every action in every situation was by the book, to the letter, without complaint, without drama, and without the slightest suggestion on Thomas's part that any of it was unusual. I asked him once, after he had been posted away from Windsor, and we were talking over a drink at a regimental function, how he had managed it. Not just the night with the mannequin, all of it. How he had walked toward the figure. How he had caught Gerald. How he had stood there in the fog with his radio dead and something wrong in the dark ahead of him, and done every single correct thing in sequence without hesitation. He thought about it for a moment. Thomas always thought before he spoke, in the way that careful people do. Then he said, "I was frightened." I said, "I know." He said, "But the job doesn't stop because you're frightened. The job is what's between you and the frightened part. The job is what you put in front of it. If you do the job, exactly the job, nothing added, nothing skipped, then the frightened part has to wait. And by the time you're done doing the job, usually the frightened part has sorted itself out." He picked up his drink. "Or you've caught a bloke from Ohio," he said. "Either way, you've done the job." I have told this story many times in the years since, at regimental dinners, at military history talks, to young officers coming up through training who think that discipline means not being afraid. I always tell them the same thing at the end. Discipline is not the absence of fear. Every soldier who has ever done anything worth doing has been afraid. The fog does not care how many years you have served. The dark does not soften because your uniform is immaculate. The thing standing in the restricted zone at 3 in the morning does not become less wrong because you are well trained. What training gives you, what those 370 years of unbroken service give you, is not the removal of fear. It is the structure to act correctly while the fear is still present. Thomas Reeve walked towards something he did not understand, in conditions that stripped away every comfort, with his radio dead and no backup and no certainty about what he would find, and he did every single correct thing in the correct order at the correct pace. That is what the King's Guard is. That is what it has always been. Not the absence of fear, the discipline to act while afraid. And if the thing you find at the end of it turns out to be a mannequin in a Tudor costume, well, you file the report. You note the lamp post number. You go back to your post. And if your regiment names the mannequin after the man you caught, and the man from Ohio writes to say he is honored, well, that is just the job. That is always just the job.